All right, so this is video 3, and in this video, we're going to look at some of the skills that historians use to tell stories or to make claims or make arguments using historical information. So you have to watch this video after you watch the one about the Stone Age societies, the ones about Paleolithic and Neolithic societies. I'd urge all of you to watch them, whether you're watching this in world history or European history or even US history if you're watching this there. Because what we're going to do here is look at those bits of information about societies and then play around with the different historical thinking skills you may have to use on the AP exam. So if you haven't watched the one about Paleolithic and Neolithic societies, I'd watch that one first, even if you're not going to take notes on it, just so you're kind of familiar with what we're talking about. So what we're going to do here is talk about our historical thinking skills. Now, the historical thinking skills are basically the types of essays you'll have to write for the AP exam. So what we're going to look at here are the types of things they might ask you to do on the AP exam when you're writing an essay. There are 3 of these historical thinking skills. The first one, I think, is the one that gets the most leverage for us. I think this is going to do a lot of the heavy lifting as we move forward, and this is the skill of comparison. A lot of what historians do is compare things. They look for similarities and differences. That's what comparison is. It's not just the similarities, it's also the differences. It's both of these things. Similarities and differences is what gives us a comparison. So let's look at the stuff we looked at in video 2 with the Paleolithic and Neolithic societies. And let's see if we can compare them. So what we want to do is look for a claim. And when we look for similarities, we want to make sure that we're not thinking of like the super obvious stuff. So what we don't want to do, don't do what I'm going to call universal truths. So universal truth. Don't do this. And it'll make sense in a second when you see what these are. We could say both Paleolithic and Neolithic societies happened on Earth. So what? I mean, who cares? That doesn't actually help us do anything. Remember, historians want to come up with a claim. This is so obvious that it doesn't actually tell us anything. Here's another one. Both Paleolithic and Neolithic societies had men and women. Yeah, so what? It doesn't help us. These are universal truths. These are things that aren't going to help us to understand what's going on in those societies. So let's look at some actual types of similarities and differences that will help us figure out claims and arguments we can make about these societies. So here's an actual claim. So do this. This is an actual type of similarity. Both Paleolithic and Neolithic societies were centered around the collection of food. Right? So in Paleolithic societies, they were talking about hunting and gathering. In Neolithic societies, they were focused on farming. But in both places, they were centered around food. They were centered around the collection of food. Here is a difference. So this is a similarity. Here's a difference. Paleolithic societies were egalitarian. And here I'm using that fancy word for meaning that things were equal. Paleolithic societies were egalitarian, while Neolithic societies were patriarchal, meaning men had most of the control. This is a difference. And if we want to get really fancy, we can even try to put them together in the same sentence. So we can say this. We can say, while both societies were focused on food collection, in Paleolithic societies, everyone collected food. In Neolithic societies, mostly men did this work. And this is a similarity and a difference, all in one. So both of these are claims. They're arguments. We have to support this with evidence. We're not going to worry about the evidence. We've done the evidence already in the previous video. Right now, I'm just showing you how to do a comparison. So that's what we're looking at here. We're looking for comparisons. Let's look at another one. Let's make another one of these fancy, nuanced comparisons. So we could say, excuse me as I look at my notes. While both societies were focused on food collection, so we're going to stick with that same similarity, and I'm doing that for a reason. You'll see why in a second. While both societies were focused on food collection, in Paleolithic societies, that was everyone's job. While in Neolithic societies, there were other jobs to do. So there's another example of a comparison. And this is kind of getting at that idea of specialization of labor. So here is a comparison, here's a comparison. Let's do one more so you can see, so you can get a really good idea of what this looks like. Remember, comparison, I think, is the one that's going to do most of the heavy lifting for us. So here's one more good example of one of these nuanced comparisons. So we're going to stick with this same similarity. I'm not going to write it out again. So dot, dot, dot. In Paleolithic societies, there was more time for leisure activities, while in Neolithic societies, most time was spent working. And that kind of gets at our idea that farming is very strenuous work. So these three are I don't want to brag, but this is the type of comparison that you should be shooting for when you write a comparison. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the second one. And the reason that I say comparison does most of the heavy lifting for us is because this second skill, which is usually abbreviated CCOT, which stands for continuity and change over time, is essentially just a different type of comparison. So continuity is really just another word for similarity, and change is really just another word for difference. So really, we're kind of doing the same thing. The only difference here is that typically comparison looks at two places at the same time, and CCOT looks at the same place at two different times. It's still the same structure. You're still going to want them to look like that. You're still going to want a CCOT and a comparison to look similar to that. That's what a good CCOT or a good comparison thesis or a claim would look like. This is just the difference. Now, let's write an example of what that might look like. So we'll do something different than talking about focusing on food collection. So here's what we could say. We could say a change over time was about when and where the food would show up. So this is in our Paleolithic times. So this is Paleolithic. Versus in Neolithic societies, it was more about how the food would show up. So really what we're talking about here is the accumulated knowledge of nature changing how food is collected. So that's a change over time. Let's put one together. Let's do a claim that has both a continuity and a change in it. So we could say a continuity over time in both societies was that they both relied on knowledge of natural cycles to produce food. So there's a continuity over time. They had to know about natural cycles. They had to know that when the weather got warmer, that's when plants would grow. And whether you're farming or gathering, that's what you need to know to produce food. But a difference, but a change over time is that in Paleolithic societies, this involved migration, moving around, and in Neolithic societies, it involved farming. So this looks very similar to what we were doing up here. The only difference with CCOT is that it's got that temporal component to it. You've got to think about change over time or continuity over time. But it's really the same kind of structure as a comparison. The last one of these, the last one, and the one that's not quite the same as comparison and CCOT, is causation. And as the name implies, this one talks about causes and effects. Causes and effects. So what we want to look for here, so claims here will look like we'll examine why things happen or what happened as a result of something. So we want to be looking for this why. Why did the shift occur? Why did this thing happen? Or what happened because of this thing? Causes and effects. So let's look at some effects. So an effect of having a surplus of food was specialization of labor, right? Because we need somebody to help us store the food, protect the food, make the food faster using metal tools. All of that stuff is a result of having a surplus of food. Here's another effect. An effect of stationary societies, and remember the fancy word we used for this was sedentary societies, was that those who owned or controlled the land had the power. They had power. Because if you're staying in one place, the land now suddenly has a lot of value. If you're always moving around, the land itself doesn't have any value because you're always going to find new land. So how about a cause? Let's look at a couple of causes. So a cause of sedentary societies was an increase in knowledge of the natural world, which led to farming. If we have a better control over our food supply, we're going to do that because it's more stable, it's safer. Here's another one. A cause of patriarchy is that farming is a labor-intensive job which men are better suited for. So those are both causes. So just a few final thoughts about this before we end this video. You're going to get a lot of practice at doing this. We are going to write a lot of these types of paragraphs and essays. So I know that I'm kind of doing this at a more advanced level. That's just because I've had a lot more practice at it than you. You're going to get plenty of practice doing this. Typically, in an essay, here's another last point, you will only really be focusing on one of these or the other. So you will be looking at causes or effects. You'll be looking at continuities or changes. You'll be looking at similarities and differences, or similarities or differences, not and differences. So you'll typically be looking at one of these or the other. As we go through content, like we did in the previous video, I will show you where you can make these types of connections. So we'll be talking about comparison quite a bit. As we get more content under our belt, we'll be looking at continuity and change over time. And as we go, we'll also be looking at causes and effects. I will show you these things as we go. So you're going to hear me talking about them. You're going to practice writing them. And remember, no one is expecting perfection. We only want to see growth and competence. I just want to see you get better at this. That's really what all your teachers want. We know you're not perfect. We just want to see you grow. Okay, so that's it for this video. This is Mr. Nissen signing off.